Chapter 43, Rito Village. First thing that Zelda noticed about the individual playing the accordion was his plumage. It was hard to miss, though many of the Rito had striking feathers. The musician's vivid mixture of bright blues and earthy yellows, whites, and browns were almost singular in how the colors flowed into and complemented one another. His dark beak took up more of his face, too, which should have made him less expressive, but as Zelda and Pia drew near he smiled with his eyes and with it showed more than a mouth could have. So, that was the first contact that the pair had with Rito Village, meeting a beautiful musician in the road. As they drew near he relaxed, and the last notes of the music echoed to silence as he lowered his accordion. "Hello, travelers," he said, seeming to take in both of them at a single glance. "Please excuse me for not greeting you earlier. I have a tendency to become lost in my playing. My name is Cass." "My name is Zelda, and my companion is Pia." Pia inclined her head to Cass, who nodded in return. "You played beautifully." Cass seemed to light up, and also to puff up very slightly as his feathers stood more on end. "How very kind of you. In truth, music is my trade. I would be a wandering musician, but there are obligations that keep me near to Rito Village. Are the two of you on your way to visit Zelda and Pia?" There was something in the way he used their names, a kind of familiarity and expectation, which gave the entire game away. He was still smiling with his eyes, an amused look that told Zelda exactly how far along in the conversation they had already gone. "Of all the places I've been and all the people I've met, I think he has solved the riddle the fastest." "You know who we are," she said. Now his smile fell away, and he turned his head slightly to look at them more squarely with his left eye. "Ah, well, there's been word spreading about the two of you, you know." Very slowly, his motions so subtle as to be almost imperceptible, he began to play again, low and quiet as if adding background to their conversation. "A Hylian woman with gold hair and a Sheikah woman with silver, carrying a Sheikh slate and ancient armor, and possessing the weapons of the long-lost champions." The light-scale trident and boulder breaker was strapped to Zelda's back, and she became suddenly aware of the weight of them. Pia was also wearing the scimitar of the Seven and Daybreaker. They make so fine that she had temporarily put away her own Sheikah weaponry. Up to this point, it had never occurred to her that anyone would recognize the weapons of the champions, save for the peoples who had acted as those weapons' caretakers. That told her something about Cass. "You're a scholar," she said. "A historian, I would guess." He didn't laugh, exactly, but his chest did vibrate while he looked away. "That is probably too generous. Think of me as more of a troubadour, collecting stories and setting them to music in the fashion of my teacher. Even calling me a bard would be going too far, I think, but I wouldn't argue with you if you insisted." The music picked up, very slightly. Zelda felt that as Pia prepared to speak, turned, was surprised by the look of concentration on the other woman's face. Pia said, "I recognize this music. It's not a composition I've heard before, but it's in the style that the Sheikah used to set poetry to song. Are you Sheikah trained?" Cass lit up again, and his playing suddenly expanded, becoming energetic and happy and upbeat, the sort that made one want to sway to it. "I am, yes. It makes me very happy to hear that you recognize the mode, my friend. My master was formerly the bard working in the court of the royal family of Hyrule, and he passed down a great deal to me. His compositions, his methods, his motifs, and his sorrows." Now he looked at Zelda, and something in the set of his eyes was apologetic. "I should confess I knew who you were at first glance. I think I would have known you even before the rumors began to circulate. When you fell at the battle on the Blattree Plain, my master was one of the men who carried you to safety. He never forgot your face, and never failed to describe you in detail when talking about you." There was more there, a great deal more, but Zelda understood without it being said that there was history there that she did not need to partake in, history that would only serve to slow her down with connections that she no longer felt. "You mentioned that word had been spreading about us." "Certainly. Granted. Mom, everywhere. My sister-in-law happened to be vacationing in Gerudo Town when the calamity attacked and when you tamed Von Aboris." He smiled again. "Well, when Chief Regent tamed Von Aboris, I suppose, but I'm guessing that Gerudo and Hylian historical records will differ on this subject." "I don't think they will, actually." Cass nodded appreciatively. As you say, so shall it surely be. Regardless, my sister-in-law stuck around just long enough for rumors to spread about your true identity, and then after that she came home with all speed. She knew I would want to hear the news, I suppose, which is just as well, as my daughters were all worried to distraction on her account. He shook his head, and the music stopped again. Pardon me. I have a tendency to run on. Having you here is a delight, but I think it is also a momentous occasion for our people. A deep roar echoed across the valley, a mechanical sound that rattled the teeth in Zelda's head, made Paya flinch, and stilled Cass's playing. All three, without prompting and with one will, turned their gazes skyward. Fall Meadow turned above them, blotting out the sun and defying the sky, the massive propellers on its wings making a thunderous sound even from this distance. It turned almost lazily, and the sky was so clear and so cloudless that looking up at it, one could lose all sense of scale. Perhaps it was only a bird, and hung lazily in the air just above their heads. But then it passed behind the massive spire of Rito village, far on its other side, and its colossal size was once more asserted. You were at last, Zelda thought. Just one more step, and we will be ready. Cass said, I have heard that the other three divine beasts all attempted to destroy the ancestral homes of the champions who once piloted them. He looked at Zelda with one eye. And that each time, the margin for protecting the people who lived there was very narrow. Each time, he barely averted catastrophe, he could have said. Zelda nodded, more to acknowledge him than anything else, and stared up at Fall Meadow. Cass was right, of course, that was a perfectly cogent description of events. She could relive, with perfect clarity, the moment that she used the Cry Honest rune to push Faruda's aim out of alignment, or when she called on Mipha to attack Farudonia, or when she threw herself bodily before the path of Von Naboris's weapon. Thinking on them now recalled the experiences down to the smallest details. The power involved. How many deaths, in each case, were only barely averted. She said, I do not imagine that this will be the same. Cass hesitated. Then, it would do my heart good to hear why you are so assured. When? She pointed at the Colossus. Simply because of how the divine beast moves. That didn't explain enough, judging by the expressions that Pyre and Cass now wore. Every time a divine beast fires its weapon, it has to be anchored. The recoil generated would throw them backward, otherwise. If Vom Meadow tried to fire its weapon from the air, then it would be sent spiraling, unable to guarantee the destruction of its target. Before it fires, it has to alight on a sturdy platform. She scowled, now, only realizing this at the same time she said it. Every possible perch in this area is within sight of all three of the other divine beasts. If it looks as if it is going to attack, and I am not sure I will be able to protect the Rito, then I will command the others to destroy Vom Meadow. Now they were staring at her. Fine. Let them stare. She was sure of this course of action. She would have done it with Naboris, if it hadn't been hidden behind steep desert cliffs. Zelda, Paya said, would you willingly destroy one of our most powerful weapons against Ganon? Without hesitation, if lives were at stake. She did not try to assure Paya, because there could be no assurances. She would give up some of her power to protect the people of this land, and whatever disadvantage that created against the calamity. They would simply have to deal with it as it arose. Her conscience would let her choose nothing else. The tension in the air had grown thick, and then Cass said, would you like a guide as you travel around Rito village? I would be happy to accompany you. The wind blew cool across their faces. Paya took the initiative to speak. It wouldn't be an inconvenience? Not at all. Not at all. Why, you could say I've been waiting for you to arrive. Come, they'll give you the tour. Believe it or not, this pond is actually very nutrient-rich and can support a small colony of hardy salmon. My daughters love to come here to fish, which is easy for me since I don't have to worry about them falling into the lake. Up ahead. And on Cass went, giving amiable and informative anecdotes about the places they passed, tied in with his personal relation to every spot. You could feel his attachment to his home, and to its history. A spire of stone rose out of a lake and on it life flourished. Homes and businesses and pathways were carved out of the rock and built up with carefully cured wood, to protect against the cold and the wind of the Tabantha winters. To ascend those steps was to ascend the steps of antiquity, not so old as the Rito themselves, but as old as their settlement in this region, stretching back into a time before recorded history. There was a kind of subdued happiness that Zelda felt in the air as they ascended Rito village, the spiral taking them past shops and gauze and people who eyed the tourists with a warm sense of curiosity. The happiness, she thought, might have been born of the sheer fact of flight, or even in its potential. She only had access to the paraglider, not wings, but looking out at the land below made her want to take an enormous leap and to soar across the waters and the land beyond, reaching some distant point on the horizon, unburdened by the ground. The subdued element to the happiness, of course, was from Ba Meadow. Cass mentioned it as they were walking, but if he hadn't then Zelda would have been able to surmise that the weapon systems of the divine beast represented a danger to anyone who wanted to fly too high. That is a thought, isn't it? To be so gifted in how you move through the world, and then to have a guardian become a predator that limits you so fundamentally. It was the same story with all the divine beasts, of course. Rudu, Rudania, and Naboris had all been guardians that had betrayed the people over whom they were supposed to preside. Something about the Rito made it feel worse, though, as much as they were not showing it in their faces or their behavior as Cass exchanged cheery greetings with shopkeepers and youths. They should be able to fly. Why do I care so much about this, in particular, even if it's true? Is this some element of my past, pushing through to the surface of my thoughts? They passed by a shrine and Zelda marked it in her head. She would need to return here, once their business was concluded. Or perhaps she wouldn't, physically speaking. She needed to attempt her experiment sooner rather than later. Cass came to a stop outside of a house near the shrine. My apologies, for once. This is my home, and I would like to take a moment to check in with my wife. Will you indulge me for a few moments? You can come in, if you like. Zelda nearly responded in the positive before cutting her eyes to Paya, who didn't shake her head so much as she clenched her hands. Not right now. Then, the tension of walking around with one new person, especially one as gregarious as Cass, was about as much as Paya could handle. Thank you for the offer, Zelda said, but we don't want to impose on you. We'll happily wait until you've finished. There was a moment where it seemed that Cass would reply, or perhaps attempt to invite them in again, but his eyes darted between both of them, and then he smiled in that particular way that the Regent did. Of course. Thank you for your patience. I will return momentarily. He went inside. Zelda and Paya stood in a relative quiet for a moment, listening to the soft murmur of Cass and his spouse talking inside of their home, and then they both wandered slowly over to the shrine that stood nearby. Neither pushed for them to move, exactly. He was just agreed, without speaking, that they should do so. Paya walked behind Zelda as the oracle stepped onto the dais, using the shake a slate to activate the travel rune. Are you holding up all right? Zelda asked. Me? Oh, with Cass. Yes, I'm doing fine, thank you. Paya hesitated. Am I doing all right? I don't want to be rude unintentionally. That made Zelda turn and look at Paya, really trying to take her in. Zelda hadn't opened up her senses with the power since the battle with Va Naboris, and was trying to avoid doing so for as long as possible, for whatever reason. She felt more sure in her own body and in the people around her if she was using her physical senses. That is probably vanity. Well, in any case she wouldn't want to engage with Paya's thoughts without explicit permission, so using her physical senses alone was what she did. And, yes, Paya was acting shy, even anxious, though it was very far removed from the degree and means that Zelda had been prepared for by prior interactions. I do not think you are being rude. No? I can't speak for Cass. Of course, I don't understand very much about Rito customs, but he seems happy to talk to us. A thought occurred to her. Does he make you nervous? Cass. Paya shook her head. No, he's very nice. He's just... Here she stopped, reached for contact. He's very much like Prince Sidon, isn't he? But he is like gently flowing water, where Prince Sidon is an inferno. Icham. That was a fair comparison. They are both rather personable, I suppose. Still, if his familiarity starts to bother you, let me know and I will, tactfully, make sure that it stops. She had expected Paya to refuse, was surprised when the other woman nodded her head and mumbled thanks. Cass emerged a couple of minutes later, no longer carrying his accordion, and his mien was perceptibly darker. Zelda asked, Is something the matter? Kaz's tone did not fall far from his cool cheeriness, but the difference was sharp enough to notice. Still, Amali tells me that two of our friends, Harth and Tiba, tried to approach Vamedo. He shook his head. I am glad that you've arrived now, friends. I fear that tensions will drive the brave and the foolish to act on those impulses, eventually and inevitably to their detriment. Someone approached the divine beast. Are they all right? Ah, yes, all things considered. He's the village's foremost boy, was wounded, but he will recover soon enough, I hope. Tiba is the best flyer the village has had since Rivali disappeared, and he managed to escape unscathed. And Ollie tells me that his wife fears he means to attack the divine beast again, this time by himself. Cass sighed, clicking his beak thrice in a kind of avian tut-tut. I should have words with him. Zelda and Paya had nothing they could say to that, the swirl of names and relationships forming a miasma around them. The three continued descending the winding path up, towards where Kased Kinelli, the village elder, made his abode. Zelda was too absorbed with the idea of people actually seeking out the divine beast, trying to fight it, to pay much attention to her surroundings or Cass's running narrative. Everywhere we have gone, people have mostly feared the divine beasts. Though there have always been those willing to fight them, it's never been something undertaken without thorough preparation. This Tiba must be either very brave or very foolish. Probably both. Something moved across Stella's consciousness, like the wind whispering a word to her, and she looked up. A broad wooden platform jutted out from the rest of the village, and something about it was intensely familiar to her. What is this place? She asked, and her question brought Cass and Paya to a stop. This. Cass's eyes were warm as he regarded the plain but well-maintained space. This is Rivali's landing. When he was training with the divine beast, he would always alight from the spot. It is difficult to oversell the importance of this place to him, though I suppose that might be hard to communicate to anyone who isn't a Rito. Similarly, Rivali was important to us, reclaiming our power of truth life for the first time in generations. Cass kept talking, smoothly and lyrically, comfortable in his rhythm and in his story. The feeling of nostalgia built up inside of Zelda, crawling up the interior of her consciousness as she stepped out onto the landing for herself. The wind was blowing here, fierce and insistent, calling her to the sky, and in that call she felt an echo of someone else. He was here. He stood here. Rivali. She focused. Cass said something behind her, and Paya, blessed Paya, asked him to wait. Zelda focused on the feeling of Rivali, on the nearness of his past self, on the person that he had once been, on who he had been to her. For the first time she smashed against the wall of her amnesia and insistently tore at it. Rivali was here. I have to remember Rivali. The wall of memory shook. She tore away a stone. Light poured from her eyes, blotting out the world. Zelda remembered. Zelda was not surprised, exactly, that her father had charged the divine champions to participate in an exhibition of their martial prowess. Gold, yes, but by no means surprised. It made sense in its own way. The champions, including the hero, were all public figures to greater or lesser degrees, and all of them would be performing tremendous acts of martial ability on behalf of the populace of every region and every kingdom in Hyrule. Why wouldn't they show off their skills against one another in a simple contest? It would prove their relative prowess, and act as a showcase for the citizenry. Mostly, she knew, the latter. The Colosseum was a day's ride to the southwest of Castletown, and Zelda had expected that only a scattering of people would attend. It was only 2 days before the ceremony where the champions and the hero would be formally named, and there were preparations to be made for what was promising to be an enormous celebration. In that respect, then, Zelda allowed herself to be surprised. Far more people came to watch the champions fight than she would have ever guessed. She did not know how many individuals the Colosseum could hold, but surely it was filled to capacity, now, with the quiet thunder of thousands of voices drowning out any single conversation. Most of the crowd was Hylian, but all the peoples of Hyrule were there gathered, including the Zor. There were actually a good deal more Rito than there seemed to be at first glance, with many of them alighting on the very rim of the stadium, their sharp eyes giving them a clear view and their ability to fly giving them access that would have been denied to any of the terrestrial or aquatic peoples. It was easy, in that crush of humanity and the building energy of the spectators, to lose track of why one was actually here, but that was only true until one's eyes wandered to the arena itself, and to the champions who now paced there. All of them but one.
I still do not understand,
Zelda said,
why you have elected not to participate.
Rivali scoffed.
I think I've been very clear on the subject, myself.
The viewing box in which Zelda was seated housed 5 people: herself, her father, 2 guards, and Rivali. It was possible that Rivali had not been invited to the viewing box. Certainly he had arrived in a flurry of motion and sound from the air, exciting whoops and shrieks from the Rito in the audience, rather than quietly entering through the hallway connected to the rear of the platform. But Zelda wasn't sure on that. Her father seemed to be avoiding looking at the Rito champion, for whatever reason, which suited her well. She hadn't spoken to Rivali since asking him to sign on to fight the Calamity. Not that the man was making it any easier. Still, she spoke calmly, even sweetly, so as not to betray her irritation.
As you say, Rivali. Still, I would appreciate an explanation that is tailored to my limited perspective.
Rivali raised a brow at her, giving the same impression that a Hylian would by tilting their mouth.
You're going to keep that act up, are you?
She said nothing, kept her face perfectly neutral as she regarded him.
All right. Look down at the arena. Tell me what you see.
She looked. 4 of the 5 champions were gathered. Well, loosely speaking, they were gathered. Urbosa, Mipha, and Derek stood near the center of the arena, conferring with each other, while Link paced back and forth at the southern end of the clearing. He was eyeing the others with a rare intensity, which they didn't seem to mind, except for Mipha, who would occasionally check where he was standing, meet his gaze, and get so flustered that she could only look at the ground. For Mipha, Zelda thought, I would be just as nervous if I was preparing to fight the so-called strongest warrior in the kingdom.
I see the 2 teams preparing for the contest to come, such as it will be. Such as it will be? Tell me, Your Highness, how do you imagine this contest going?
The roar of the crowd died down as the king rose and lifted his arms. He began a speech he had been preparing for days, extolling the virtues of the gathered champions to be both as warriors and as representatives of Hyrule. He'd had to edit it only very little after Rivali had decided to abstain from the battle, apparently. Zelda and Rivali both ignored him.
I cannot pretend to know how martially capable Mipha is,
Zelda said,
but I've seen Daruk fight and witnessed Urbosa foil an assassination. Daruk is, for all intents and purposes, unstoppable. I've seen him crush nearly a dozen bokoblins in as many seconds, and he wasn't even winded in the attempt. And Urbosa?
Something in Rivali's tone was teasing, and for 1 second Zelda thought he might be mocking the Gerudo chief, or else Zelda's faith in her, and her temper flared. She got it under control before she spoke.
I genuinely believe that there is no one who is as skilled or as dangerous as Urbosa is, even before her mastery of lightning. I see. And I suppose that you would have as much perspective on the great Urbosa as anyone. Now, tell me, Your Highness, how are our contestants armed?
Of course Rivali would have noticed such a thing. He was a warrior, while she wasn't. She'd been paying attention solely to the way that the champions were standing in relation to each other, to the group spacing from Link. Now she focused, really focused, on what each fighter was holding.
All of them seemed to be holding training weapons made of blunted wood. Mipha has a spear, Urbosa a short sword and round shield, and Daruk has what appears to be a freshly cut log.
And the hero. Now she stopped, looking at the pacing youth.
Has he not drawn his weapon? They don't make scabbards for training swords, I don't think. He's holding everything he'll use.
She squinted, trying to see across the distance.
He has a metal shield and... nothing. His right hand is red. He's unarmed. The red is paint,
Rivali said.
You've never seen him fight, have you? They gave him that paint because if he was using a sword, even a wooden one, he would either hurt others or shatter the weapon in his hands. So instead he's supposed to get inside their guard and paint their vitals.
Zelda frowned.
You mean to say that the hero is so skilled that he must go unarmed while the greatest warriors from every region of Hyrule carry weapons? The idea is farcical.
Rivoli said, in a tone so earnest it took Zelda back.
I happen to agree.
He shook his head.
The king's speech is winding down. Listen, I'm not meaning to say anything except for this. You're a little hero against Mipha, Daruk, and Urbosa? That's a fair fight.
Rivali's tendency towards self-aggrandizing was, by now, rote, but this went so far that she found herself scowling at him. He did not care for decorum, so she could let her slip, however slightly.
Do you mean to say that your involvement would tip the scales, when nobody else's would? No. I'll explain in a moment. Watch, they're about to begin. Watch, or you'll miss it.
She whipped her attention back to the arena. Her father lowered his arms. Trumpets blared as Daruk and Urbosa edged forward, weapons in hand. Mipha hung back, though she was no less prepared, sinking low in some sort of martial stance that kept her spear's head near to the ground.
Mipha is the healer,
Rivali said.
He'll go for her first.
A small shake explosive was detonated in the air, the heavy crack acting as the signal. Things happened all at once. Zelda caught only glimpses. Link was not a person. He was a blur, rocketing across the arena like a flash of lightning. Urbosa swung for him with her shield, and he ducked under her, avoiding Daruk entirely. Mipha's spear was alive in her hands, tracing eye-searing patterns in the air in front of her, but there was a resounding, constant thunder of wood on steel as Link intercepted every thrust and strike. There was a louder sound, and Mipha's spear went spinning into the air. Then Link was in front of her, his right arm a blur. Less than a heartbeat later he was gone again. Zelda's eyes stayed on Mipha for that moment. It was hard to see against the color of her skin, but a brighter red had been painted across her throat, the joint of her arms, and her stomach. As Zelda watched, the Zora princess touched the place where Link had marked her throat, then brought her fingers up to her lips. She's in shock, Zelda thought. Mipha's spear hit the ground. Urbosa was a whirlwind, a flurry of motion. He might as well have been performing a carefully choreographed dance with the blue thunderbolt in front of her. Zelda could not follow all of the chief's movements, but she could see that Urbosa was using the same style as when she fought the Yiga assassins outside of Gerudo Town, parrying and whirling and cutting, but Link stayed out of range, moving in false starts and feints that made Urbosa swing at nothing, hitting only the air with her sword and shield. Then Daruk was there, swinging, and Link ducked under the enormous wooden blade and came up with his right hand, which was stopped short by Daruk's protection. There was a crackle on Link's shield, a gathering of light that was almost imperceptible to the audience, but that drew Zelda's eye, because she knew the mark of Urbosa's fury. Urbosa held up her hand. In the same instant that Urbosa snapped her fingers, Link held his shield directly at the chief. Lightning struck the shield in Urbosa. The chief of the Gerudo wasn't harmed by the lightning. Zelda knew she couldn't be, but Urbosa had to bring up her own shield to stop the projectile from hitting her in the face, and then Link was in front of her, his hand flashing in and out before he was gone again. Urbosa looked down at the red line across her abdomen, scowled, and shook her head. She looked up, seeking Zelda, and when their eyes met, Urbosa could only shrug. Link slammed into Daruk's protection, the big brother of the Gorons grinning impishly behind his impenetrable barrier. Link could hit hard, but he couldn't break Daruk's protection with his speed or with his bare hands. As if answering Daruk's grin, Link knelt in front of the Goron champion. The entire Colosseum had been almost completely silent during this exchange. Things were happening too quickly to believe, much less to react to. Something in that silence shifted, though, becoming much more pronounced, as Link worked his arms underneath Daruk's protection. Everyone in the audience could hear the exhalation as he hoisted Daruk, barrier and all, and then with a shout of effort, lifted the shining red orb of protective magic over his head. Zelda's mouth hung open. She didn't care that she was showing her shock. She glanced at her father, whose color had drained from his face, and then at Rivoli, who was, infuriatingly, unsurprised with how this seemed to be going. Link took one step, holding Daruk over his head. Then another, and another. He was headed in the direction of the arena's gate. An image occurred to Zelda. Then, and she understood that it occurred to everyone else present simultaneously, Link carrying Dark, whose protection made him immune to the force of Link's hands, but not to the force of gravity, which would be his greatest enemy when Link threw him into a ravine. It must have occurred to Dark, too.
I yield.
The protection disappeared, and Dark dropped heavily onto Link's hands. The hero, for his part, was still holding the Goron aloft.
I yield. You win. You win.
Silence. Then the entire stadium exploded in a riot of noise and sound and shouting and whistling, an eruption of a volume that made Zelda cover her ears. She'd never heard anything this loud in her life, and also she didn't care in the least. She was still staring when Link set Dark onto the ground, when Mipha and Urbosa joined the two of them and seemed to laugh at something Dark said. Link, for his part, stood passively.
Well?
Rivali said. Somehow, his voice cut through the din, drawing her attention insistently and instantly.
Do you understand now?
That was a genuine question. It was also a challenge. Well, she could answer a challenge, couldn't she? And why not?
The only thing I understand,
she said,
is that the hero seems to be everything that the stories about him would suggest.
That frustrated her. It had frustrated her from the moment he had returned from the Lost Woods carrying the Master Sword.
I saw how skilled you are with a bow, Rivali. I'd argue that you're peerless with it, in the air.
He must have agreed, because he looked very perceptibly more smug.
Given that performance, do you think that your involvement would have swayed the match in favor of the other champions? I don't know,
he said, which she was not expecting.
But I can tell you this, it would have ended in serious injuries for at least one person involved.
After what she had just watched, she had trouble imagining it.
What makes you say that? There's something you don't realize about fighters, Your Highness. Not that I can blame you, since you aren't familiar with the art yourself. But don't worry, I'm here for nothing if not to lend my expertise.
Oh, she hated that, but she had to listen.
Simply put, there is a threshold of performance past which we would not be able to hold back against each other. Say that I did go out there, with a decent bow and a quiver full of padded arrows, and used my absolutely dominating command of the air to pelt the would-be hero from every direction while he tried to deal with, say, Mipha. He would have no way to counter this, except to fight with the intent to disable me, perhaps with a spear or with a bow of his own. And if Link is armed, then suddenly everyone must fight with the intent to harm just to keep up with him. Tell me, how much stronger is Dark when he's swinging around that big slab of sheet rock he calls a weapon? Was Urbosa fighting as hard as she could, just now?
Once, when she was very small, only barely old enough to recall, so small that her mother had been with her, a terrible sandstorm had descended on Gerudo Town, all wind and lightning and destruction. Zelda could not clearly remember that day, but she did remember the image of Urbosa wearing a golden helm, standing against the storm, leashing lightning in her hands, calling nature to heal. She and her mother had watched as Urbosa's fury had calmed the desert and cleared the skies.
No,
Zelda said, with perfect confidence.
No, she was not fighting at her hardest. At her most powerful, with the Thunder Helm, Urbosa might well be able to level the stadium. Oh, sure. That's kind of a weird, extreme example, but you see what I mean. What you just saw was actually a fairly close match, all appearances to the contrary notwithstanding, but once I'm added to the mix the balance is thrown off, and before you know it everything is much more intense, much more violent, and much more dangerous. So it was only reasonable for me to stand back, and to allow the fight to play out as it had to.
The roar of the crowd had not died away, in spite of the king's attempts to quiet the spectators, and Zelda could not help watching the four warriors in the center of the arena. They seemed so close when they stood like that, laughing and joking, and something about their closeness made her feel much farther away from them than the physical distance could suggest on its own. How intimate they seem. Could I be like them, too, if I could master myself as they have themselves, as the hero has himself? What a notion.
It seems to me,
she said to Rivali,
that it was mostly reasonable to preserve your dignity.
She had expected him to puff up, or to scoff, or to fume, or any number of things. She did not expect him to laugh as if she'd made a joke, his whole body shaking with mirth as he held his sides. His laughter was so perfectly calculated and measured in its arrogance that she couldn't even feel bad for her own meanness.
Your Highness,
he said.
If you think that my passing on this little scene is due to lack of confidence, I suppose I have no choice but to correct you. I had been hoping to prevent any injuries to the other champions or to your little soldier, but if Myth is here, then I suppose all of that can be patched up, can it?
Wait, I didn't mean for him to go this far.
Rivali, I didn't mean. However, I cannot promise that the boy with the sword won't suffer wounds to his ego, and I don't think healing magic will be able to help with that.
I have started something very dangerous. The king was still trying to get the crowd's attention, to calm the feverish jubilation that met the clash of the champions, and the stress was telling on his face. That was when Rivali leaped onto the railing at the edge of the balcony, puffed out his chest, and let loose a cry that was commensurate with his size, a screech that silenced the crowd all at once as many spectators, especially the Rito, instinctively looked to the sky. Silence followed, during which Zelda and her father both stared at Rivali, who was looking very pleased with himself. Then he spoke, and he projected across the entire arena.
Gathered peoples of Hyrule, what you have just seen is a spectacular rarity, the full and unrestrained prowess of the greatest warriors who walk the fields or swim in the waters. Though the exchange was brief, that briefness is only thanks to the spectacular skill of all of those involved. Win or lose, the battle to which we paid witness could last only for moments. This is the nature of battle. It flares for only a moment and then vanishes, like a thunderbolt.
Urbosa visibly rolled her eyes. The crowd whooped. Zelda could not imagine why, but they seemed to like Rivali.
Still, to be given such meager fare when so many of us have traveled so far. Should there not be one more fight?
Maybe it wasn't Rivali that made the crowd respond with a roar of enthusiasm so unimpeded that the king looked out upon his subjects with barely suppressed alarm. Zelda decided, in that moment, that they liked the action, the thrill of combat without the risk of injury or death. They liked the idea of the strongest representatives of their own people being able to show off their strength. But how weighted that anticipation must be, when one of those representatives is the hero of legend. How could anyone compare it?
Now, it needs to be said,
Rivali continued,
that those participants in this battle of champions are superb fighters, but I did not misspeak when I said that they are the best warriors to walk the land.
Now his words were a challenge.
But after all, what is all of that compared to one who treads through the heavens?
The crowd erupted again as Rivali leaped from the balcony, twirling gracefully through the air before landing in the arena with a flourish. The voices of the Rito spectators, in particular, rang out above the others. Zelda could not actually hear Urbosa, but knew her well enough to guess at what the chief of the Gerudo was saying as she walked away, waving her hand dismissively. Rivali threw some retort at Urbosa's back, but the words were lost in the din. Darklaw, shaking his head, and followed Urbosa. Mipha, who was still absent-mindedly touching her throat, and Zelda wondered if the paint was irritating the Zora princess's skin, looked to the hero for long moments before following Dark. Rivali made a sweeping bow, holding out his right wing to Link in a gesture that was almost mocking in its challenge.
Well then, the proclaimed hero of Hyrule,
Rivali said, projecting enough so that the crowd could hear him, and they responded with silence to better catch his words.
Will you answer my call for a single challenge? Would you rather let the Zora princess tend to your aches and your weariness first? Or will you fight me with everything you have?
Link did not answer. He looked up to the viewing box. To the king. He was the foremost member of the royal guard, after all, and answered to the king alone. Rome Boss Foramus Hyrule's face was grave as he nodded. The crowd erupted again, and the noise did not die away as the combatants were prepared. Link and Rivali both took training swords, sturdy bows, and arrows with padded tips, enough to hurt or even break a bone, but nothing that could not be patched up by Mipha in the case of an emergency. Link kept his shield, but when Rivali was offered one he turned his face away as if disgusted by the idea, an affectation that endeared him even more to the onlookers.
I do not think that I will share in Urbosa's need,
he announced, and the crowd roared. How quickly things are moving, Zelda thought. Who do I want to win in this exchange? Certainly Rivali was invested with, even, the sort of arrogance that made her instantly and insistently hope that he would be made more humble by being shown his own limits. But the crowd loved him, the Rito seemed to adore him, and there was something about the depths of his confidence when facing down the man who was named worthy by the Master Sword that spoke to her just as it spoke to any of the other spectators. Besides, there is more than one kind of arrogance. Rivali is open with his confidence, makes himself vulnerable in its expression, and with his mouth makes promises that his body must work to fulfill. Is that somehow worse than the arrogance of a man who does not deign to even show interest in the people around him, whose confidence is so absolute that he never bothers to even voice it? The hero checked his straps on his gauntlets. Then he weighed the balance of his bow, checked its string, and must have found it satisfactory. He gave no sign of anything, though, responding to neither the crowd nor to Rivali's laughing jeers. No, the latter isn't just confidence, nor even arrogance. It is contempt. An elevation of the self beyond one's surroundings and one's peers. As if being chosen arbitrarily by a magic sword could serve to act as true proof of an inherent goodness, or strength of arm translate into something more profound. So, that was lit. She wanted Rivali to win. The trumpets were blown, and all sense of revelry disappeared from the Rito champion as Rivali knelt on the ground, spreading his wings to either side of him. His eyes were locked on the Hylian champion, who was sinking down into a crutch, legs gathering power for a leap. The crack of a shake explosive. The sand of the arena rose in a cloud as a whirlwind erupted to life in its center, and Zelda shielded her face with her arms. Link's sword passed through the spot where Rivali had been as the Rito champion rocketed into the air, rising even more quickly than Link had charged. In the space of a heartbeat he had cleared the entire Colosseum, and the Rito spectators cheered and laughed as he flew. Then Rivali came back down, and he was a shock of dark blue flitting around the arena with a grace and alacrity that should have been impossible for someone his size. He was as agile, or more, than a sparrow. He was everywhere at once, and Zelda could not track him with her eye. Every time she focused he seemed to have already moved to the other side of the stadium. Arrows pelted Link's shield like raindrops on a metal roof, and when Zelda stopped trying to follow the avian warrior and turned her eyes to the earthbound one, she saw that the hero was nearly pirouetting, keeping up with Rivali's flight in a way that the spectators could not. Every one of Rivali's arrows would have struck directly home, except that Link stopped them with carefully angled steel. Then one of the arrows hit the ground. Link came up from the roll and leaped into the air. His bow was in his hands. Something he did then made Zelda's eyes hurt. It was very hard to look at. Rivali soared higher. Nobody would see them until much later, but in his wake he left behind 20 broken arrows, which had been fired nearly simultaneously and which he had only barely been able to avoid. In the moment Zelda thought she saw Rivali's eyes wide with shock, but he was moving too quickly to be sure. Another flash, and then Rivali was in Link's face, faster than the hero could draw his sword, wielding his own weapon with pure, unadulterated aggression. Link parried, then drew and swung in one motion, but Rivali was already in the air again. A gust of wind nearly threw Link off of his feet, and the hero regained his footing at the same moment that Rivali landed, all grace, on the other side of the arena. "Watch, now!" Rivali shouted over the adulation of the crowd, spreading his wings once more.
"Keep your eyes on this. The next exchange will decide it."
Zelda had to unclench her hands, lest she tear her gloves. Link was standing in one place, and then he was charging, and the stadium held its breath. Rivali shouted, "Ah!" The breath was pulled from Zelda's chest by the sudden shift in air pressure. She felt herself being pulled, and her hands closed hard on the railing for fear that she might be lifted toward the sky. The maelstrom that was born in the center of the arena was like a cyclone being born directly underneath Link's feet. Zelda could see the hero's eyes widening as the wind lifted him from the ground, and then he went hurtling straight up, his ascent like Rivali's, save that Link's was an uncontrolled tumble. Rivali's laughter was nearly lost in the wind's roar as he flew up and above the arena, circling the outside of the whirlwind. Zelda craned her neck to look up, to see as the greatest warrior among the Rito rose to sink his talons into the Hylian champion. The Rito crowd standing atop the stadium spread their wings and rose, catching stray currents to gain a better vantage point. Zelda saw as Link somehow righted himself midair, and then his bow tumbled and spun away, torn from his back by the gale. Rivali came around, his own bow in his hands, arrow firmly nocked. The finishing blow. Link spun. There was a flash between the two warriors. A sound reached the arena, like a wooden spoon hitting the bottom of an iron pot. The wind died. Link and Rivali both fell. Link was conscious, but Rivali plainly wasn't. The other Rito swooped in, grabbing the warriors from the air. Amid the cheering of the crowd, the unbelieving excitement at the sheer spectacle they had just borne witness to, the enthusiasm that was so infectious that Zelda was nearly caught up in it, she saw an object hit the ground. It took her a moment to recognize it for what it was. It looked unusual. After all, Link's shield had one of Rivali's feathers stuck to it. I suppose one must have been dislodged when it struck Rivali in the head. He should have taken his cue from Urbosa. She had to admit that had been an impressive throw. The wall of her amnesia threatened to tumble completely, as if her purposefully pulling away a single brick had compromised its structure. Perhaps it has, she thought, as she grabbed hold of the power and shoved it back into place. Still, I cannot afford to let everything break yet. That was not an honest representation of the panic she felt, trying to maintain her own memory blockage. She was aware, on an instinctual level, of two things. The first was that, if she remembered everything all at once, the memories of the goddess would harm her. They might not kill her, but they would certainly change her. Perhaps she would charge to Link's side, possessed of an immense need to see him safe, echoing the attachment that the goddess had to one of the heroes of a long-lost age. Perhaps she would become the girl who had fallen in battle with the calamity a century ago. She might lose herself, becoming someone completely different, lost in a maelstrom of memory and knowledge that she had no way to categorize. That was the second point. She wasn't ready yet. Whatever would happen should only happen naturally. Something inside of her had constructed this wall of her amnesia, protecting her from herself until she was ready to be everything. With the power she reinforced the wall, held it, waited. The wall stilled. Her amnesia helped. She was in no danger of remembering more than she should. She sighed in relief, opened her eyes, and turned. And jumped, when she saw that Cass and Pyre were both staring at her. How must I have looked just now?
Please excuse me. I just recovered one of my memories. This one was interesting.
Cass smiled, that same disarming smile he had used when they met on the road, and something in it made her feel more at ease even though she'd known him for less than an hour.
Yes, Pyre was just telling me about your lost memory.
That was something of a shock, but if Cass already knew so much about her, then it made sense that Pyre would tell him more, to contextualize what was happening.
I imagine you must have many interesting stories to share, given how much time and effort you've put into rediscovering your place in the world. May I ask what you remembered just now?
I remembered feeling a kind of petty desire to see Link brought low, and putting that hope into Rivali in spite of the fact that I thought he was arrogant and foolish.
I remembered Rivali. Before he was confirmed as a champion, there was an exhibition held where the champions showed off their martial prowess before the gathered peoples of Hyrule. He challenged the hero to single combat.
It was hard to be sure, but Zelda thought Cass looked excited by that prospect.
Indeed, that must have been quite the sight. Granted that he could not wield the Master Sword, but Rivali is thought by scholars to be the greatest Rito warrior in modern history, as well as a peerless scholar of flight. Tell me, what did you think of him?
She winced before she could stop herself, and Cass laughed.
Well, that's fair. You know, my teacher used to say that Rivali's skill was only eclipsed by his arrogance, and that everything he achieved was in pursuit of convincing the world that he was who he thought himself to be.
He tilted his head thoughtfully.
Perhaps that is the way of some heroes.
Zelda and Pyre exchanged glances. There was nothing graceful for them to say. Cass seemed to realize this. It occurred to Zelda, in fact, that he may have said what he did specifically so that he would get the last word as he began to walk away. He said amiably as he walked back toward the village spire,
Well, we can discuss the idea more as we ascend. I'd like to take you to meet the Elder now. He will surely have ideas about how best to approach the divine beast.
Of course, Zelda said. The question of how to reach the divine beast, who hung in the sky, had been bothering her for some time. Perhaps I could ride one of the flying guardians, She and Pia followed Cass as the afternoon wore on. End of chapter.